Welcome to the Zen Stoic Path. On this special segment of our show, we go into the liberated life interviews. Zen Stoic is a philosophy that aims at creating liberation, but the philosophy itself is not liberation, just like how the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. So on these episodes, we go into the liberated life interviews because we interview people that show us how to live a more liberated life. And this episode is a very special guest. We have Stefanos Sifandos. Now, the reason why I invited Stefanos onto the show is because I had a personal breakthrough with Stefanos that was absolutely amazing at a retreat that I was attending. So I had not known Stefanos before, but we got to talk. He walked me through a process that created this tremendous breakthrough for me from a somatic place. So in other words, we were able to release trapped energy that was in my body. And the result of it was that I was actually able to more easily and effortlessly set healthy boundaries in my life, whereas previously I wasn't able to do it to the extent that I am now. And Stefanos was a big catalyst in that work. So I am truly, truly grateful for the work that Stefanos and I did, and I am absolutely blown away with the conversation that we got to have on this episode. For those of you who don't know Stefanos, here's his bio. So with over 20 years of direct experience in the personal transformation space, Stefanos understands peak performance potential. He is a trained educator and relationship expert with a background in behavioral science. He is passionate about leading people closer to their highest potential and each other. Stefanos' philosophy merges the best of Eastern and Western methodologies to promote spiritual balance and empower people in life and love. From trauma release to navigating the at times murky waters of modern masculinity to helping women understand the men in their lives, he helps people escape negative patterns and cultivate a positive sense of self. Stefanos has also co-founded both a world-class coaching and education institute and global men's empowerment movement, and has been involved in multiple 8- and 9-figure startups. Stefanos has worked with thousands of men and women from all walks of life, special forces soldiers, Olympic gold medalists, elite fighters, and everyday people have relied on him to restructure and reframe their relationships with themselves and their loved ones. So this is a really special episode because we get to explore the mind of Stefanos as he talks through how to actually release things somatically from our nervous system so that we may live a more liberated life. This was an amazing conversation that I was grateful to be a part of, and I know you'll enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed having the conversation with Stefanos. Let's get into the show.
I guess in the past, the way that I've dealt with challenges is a couple of ways. I either go really head into the challenge, or I get really, really frustrated. And so I see myself, I'm not as frustrated as I used to be, but I see myself still getting frustrated and still not functioning off like adrenaline and anger to sort of motivate moving forward, as opposed to, all right, let me be a little more calm and let me just connect all the pieces here, as opposed to connecting them in like very abrasive ways.
Yes. Which is usually what one does to piece things together when you use anger to fuel you in those situations, right?
Of course, right? It's because it gets shit done. So
of course,
because it gets shit done, and things need to get done. When you're in that sort of survival mode, it's all about, well, what do I need to do to get out of survival mode? And
what's
so
the result that will solve this?
Yeah. And so the fuel behind that, for me, commonly, what my body is accustomed to is anger. Or just frustration, right? Frustration more than anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I find the opposite with me. Frustration actually slows me down. Like it kind of buries me in my stuff.
Yeah.
And sometimes anger will do it to get things done and to get out of that, to piece things together. But I've always found that it hasn't been sustainable for me, at least.
It's not sustainable for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. What's your view on seeing these things in your external reality and the reflection that the internal world might be having on that?
Shame.
Yeah.
So it's guilt and shame. It's like, oh, I'm back here again. Like, why am I getting frustrated? Why am I getting angry? Why am I getting upset? Why am I not being different? Why have I not evolved? Yeah, and of course I have. I know I have, but there's parts of me that just think, so everything that's happening in the external world is not working the way that I think it needs to work, right? Yeah. Or at least some of it isn't working the way that I want it to work. And then my internal response or reaction rather is the frustration, the anger, what we spoke about. Not always, but commonly. And so that fuels me. And just to add something, side note, that also dampens me as well sometimes, where the frustration, the anger overwhelms me and it debilitates me in taking action, and I rebel. This is part of the internal process. I start rebelling. So I'm like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I don't want to take responsibility of that. I just want to check out. So in the past, I would have checked out with food, sex, travel, adventure, adrenaline, you know, like very mindlessly and unconsciously.
Yes.
Now I still check out using vices, so to speak. I may emotionally eat, or I may use exercise as a crux. And so I really exhaust myself in that to sort of burn that energy, but I'm still distracting myself away from my responsibilities,
yes,
like the things that I've chosen that I want to do as a side note. But so that internal thing is that now that I'm not getting it right, that I'm doing the thing that I should be doing as a father, as a husband, as a man, as a human being, whatever, as someone that's evolved, is shame. I feel shame about that. So that's the internal process. Now, again, in the past, I haven't been able to temper that shame. And so I have to go into immense, extreme, intense avoidance.
Yes.
Again, all the cruxes, the addictions, whatever. Now I'm able to sit with it a little longer and sort of transmute it and be with it and work with it and breathe with it and understand it and connect to that part of me that is feeling resistance or withdrawing or feeling hurt or feeling shame. But I don't always get it straight away. And so sometimes there are pockets and microcosms of retraction and microcosms of leaning into addictions. You know, it could even be I just want to watch movies all night or all day or something, you know, where I'm completely distracted from what's happening in my physical reality.
Yeah. I have a term for that. I like to call it emotional debt. It gets stored up in the nervous system and we carry it. And that's why your work, I think, is so valuable, especially with the somatic release that you do, because it gets stuck in us beyond what we can verbally recall or even consciously remember, like, this is why I'm feeling this way. And we try to defer that emotional debt over and over and over again with those distractions. So I think it's really interesting that you also work with the somatic release techniques, which is how you and I kind of got to this podcast in the first place, right? I had this massive breakthrough with you at a retreat that you took me through this process. How and why did you get into that type of work?
I think largely because of all the things that we've been speaking to thus far. You know, for example, my anger, my frustration, my shame, it's been born from somewhere. It's been born from hardship. It's been born from, and I'm not saying I'm the only one that's experienced hardship in any capacity, but it was born from living a life where I wasn't connected to myself, where I was really struggling, where life was really, really difficult. I didn't feel safe in my environment. I didn't feel safe with my parents. I didn't feel safe with people in my life. There was bullying, there was violence, there was animosity, there was volatility. There was just so much unknown and uncertainty. And so what I discovered as a result of moving through so much of this as a child, as a teenager, and even as an adult, and a lot of it being self-inflicted as an adult because I was unable, unwilling, and too scared to actually address my trauma and address this stuff. And I'd done so much talk therapy. And just as, again, as another side note, I don't have any negative connotations towards talk therapy. I think it's actually a valuable part of our healing journey. In fact, science can demonstrate this, that physiologically, for us to actually move beyond our stories or beyond our interpretation of self, we do need to be able to reframe the way that we've seen certain events. There has to be a sequence in that. And a big part of that healing process is somatic release, is releasing the trauma through the body. And so until I really started pairing all the talk therapy that I was doing and the reconstruction of self and the reconstruction of my previous stories and my history and my past, until I really integrated somatic work in that, I felt empty. I didn't feel whole. And that was what gave me greater completion. That's what gave me greater expansion, healing into myself. And so that's why I'm able to now not allow my frustrations to fester forever, basically, for weeks and months and years. It may only be hours and days. And then the frustrations keep coming back. But I'm able to work with them with greater integrity, with greater humility, with more compassion, with more empathy towards myself. And if I do allow it to be a runaway train, I can be nicer to myself during that process as well. Because in the past, if I allowed it to be a runaway train, I'd just be harder on myself, which would make the train run away further.
Yeah,
and faster.
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, charging yourself interest on that emotional debt, the way that I would typically put it with a client, because you're finding a new way to beat yourself up, a new way to shame yourself by asking yourself the question, haven't I already dealt with this? Why am I dealing with this again?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting the way that you've said it, how talk therapy gives us that ability to reframe our experience, but then getting even deeper to beyond where our language can take us can really create that release so that you're able to actually genuinely be kinder to yourself in these moments.
Yeah. For many of us, not all of us, and the reframing process is very important, but the reframing process, I believe, and so does the coaching institute that I co-own with 3 other amazing human beings, we're of the belief that reframing process has to be in a very certain sequence, and it has to be in a timely manner. And so with that said, the retelling of stories for me, without that somatic integration or release, I really felt lost, and I would spiral. I would spiral. And for most of us, or I shouldn't say most of us, for some of us, much of the experience and many of the experiences that we have as adults or as teenagers, or let's just say post-language, right? Post-linguistic adaptation, that are traumatic. So it could be molestation, it could be physical violence, it could be bullying, it could be a bad breakup, whatever it may be. What actually feeds and amplifies the intensity of that situation, or rather the intensity of the way that we interpret it, is at times experiences that we've had pre-language, that have in the womb even, or before we've been able to, pre-verbalization, I should say.
Yes.
Right. And so dealing with that somatically in the unconscious self, for lack of a better term, can be deeply rewarding and healing to actually, it's almost like this is what my wife says. And I can't remember if I gave you this example, but you imagine there's a thin gold chain in your drawer, and you're clearing out your drawer, and then you get the gold chain and it's full of knots, and you're trying to unknot the chain, but you just can't do it. But then you get that one knot that all the other knots just undo. So trauma almost is like that. There are core wounds that we experience in various capacities. And when we unravel those core wounds, all the other wounds that followed it, they become so much easier to deal with and to be with. Yeah.
Most definitely. I love that you brought that up with the unconscious self and how some of these experiences can be imprinted on that unconscious self, especially like in times in the womb. One of our mutual friends, recent Michelle Dillard, as they just got married, did an amazing job officiating, by the way. I love that. But she was a coach of mine in the beginning of this year, and we did a process. We did some timeline therapy, which I do with my clients and I teach them as well. And when we did guilt, we were releasing the negative emotion of guilt, we realized that it occurred month 3 in the womb. And what I didn't realize is that it actually filtered my entire personality in the way that I approached everything. Because the belief that I had come up with from that was that I am getting to live a life at the cost of my mother's, because she only lived for 7 years after I was born. So it was in that moment that on some level, I knew that she wasn't going to be around very much. So I lived a lot of my life pleasing people, a lot of my life thinking that I needed to do something to deserve to be here. And because of the work that her and I did together, I was able to release that. So I'm a huge advocate of that type of work, of going to the unconscious, because a lot of the time we don't even know consciously where some of this stuff is coming from. So that was actually even part of our work together. And that retreat was, the things that had come up for me with my mother. And that was just the beginning of that work that I started to release that.
That's really big, man. It's interesting you said at 3 months. At 3 months, my understanding is that at 3 months in the womb is when our nervous system starts to form in a more profound way as well. And so, that guilt or whatever is being absorbed is really embedding itself in your being at that early stage of your development.
Yeah. And it was big, because the moment I released that, I started being genuine, sincere. If I didn't like something, I didn't pretend to like it just to make everyone else happy. I was actually saying what was on my mind. Wasn't being a dick, but I was being sincere with my needs, with my emotions that I would feel. I wouldn't tell somebody that I was doing good when I wasn't. And as a result, I felt a lot freer within myself, because I noticed that the masking of those emotions, the telling somebody that I feel okay or I feel good when I don't was actually just was perpetuating those feelings more and more. And so I even appreciated today when you and I interacted. You told me exactly how you were feeling. You didn't sugarcoat a thing. And so I think that's really beautiful, because in being sincere with one another, it gives permission for others to do the same.
Yeah, I think permission and growth as well, right? So for example, let's just assume for a moment in that instance when you said, hey man, how are you? And I said, I'm okay, which was a very true response.
Yeah.
Because I'm in excitement of just being alive and actually sleeping last night, because my wife, Christine was sort of on duty, air conditioning duty. Will ever end anyway. And I was also just frustrated. And so, and I just, too much information, but I just got off a call with someone who was just speaking so much, and he could have told me what he needed to tell me in 5 minutes. I needed to let him speak because it was a business conversation. Anyway, that's irrelevant. But what I was saying was that in those moments of sharing, and there's, yes, it's permission for other people to do the same, and it's also growth opportunity. So let's assume that in that moment, you were still stuck in your people pleaser pattern, right? Or you were, let's just use that. You were stuck in your people pleaser pattern. And I said to you, instead of saying, yeah, I'm good, or I'm great, or I'm excited about this podcast, I just shared, yeah, I'm okay, and I'm really frustrated. And all of a sudden, the growth opportunities, if you're in that pattern, is to not be in that pattern. Because I'm in my truth, you may think and feel, oh, I need to make sure that he's okay now. I've got to make sure that he's okay. Because the people pleaser pattern is all about making sure everyone else is okay, right? At the expense of self, right? It's maximizing others, minimizing self. And so the opportunity for you in that moment, if you were hypothetically in that pattern, would to not succumb to that pattern, to not need to make me okay, and to maybe just practice, or tell me more, practice curiosity, or I'm sorry to hear that, practice compassion, and know that, and also the other opportunity is for you to go within and say, I'm okay. Just because he's not okay doesn't mean that I'm not okay.
Yes.
Doesn't mean that I can't be okay. So there's a beautiful opportunity that we have when we're in our truth that is beyond just permission. And it's definitely, that's a big part of it, but it's also the growth. And that's my, I guess, existential, philosophical assessment of our existence, of our consciousness.
Like that we're going
here. Of our consciousness, is that I think one of the reasons where we could argue that we're not accelerating consciousness in the way that we could, and this is an internal feeling, it's an intuition. And I'm not saying that we're not accelerating, I believe we are, but in the way that we could is because we're so scared of being truthful. Because we're so scared of being seen, we're scared of being rejected, humiliated, we're carrying on to core wounds, trauma it's undealt with, unresolved trauma. There are many reasons why we're not being truthful, but in not being truthful, we are actually limiting our capacity to expand consciousness, because we're not providing multiple or amplified growth opportunities, because we're all trying to please each other at some level. We're all people pleasers at some level. We're all trying to make sure everyone else is okay. And in doing so, we're not refining, we're withdrawing, and we're limiting our expression.
Yes.
And we're wearing so many masks just to make sure everything fits in this perfect world. It can't be perfect, and it shouldn't be perfect. It needs to be messy, because it's from the messy that we can repair. We lack that in our society so much. That's just my perspective on
I like that perspective a lot. Especially because it is what is natural and authentic to as a byproduct of free will. If we are truly living a reality of free will, it's going to be messy, because we're going to try things and we're going to say things and do things that are not necessarily perfect or flawless. And it is my belief, and it has been for a while, that our true perfection exists in all of those perceived imperfections, that is where we find that, and that's where we are just real with one another. For what reason do you think it is that people are so afraid of being truthful with themselves?
We're afraid to be hurt again, because we haven't dealt with the hurt that was once inflicted upon us, or that we experienced, or that we interpreted in our world, in our nervous systems, externally, internally. And so everything is an avoidance of that. Essentially, like if I was to generalize it, if I were to just put a broad brushstroke paintbrush over it, it's we just don't want to feel that pain again. We don't want to feel that discomfort again, that trauma. And so we'll do everything we can to avoid that. And more often than not, it's not being in our truth, because when we were hurt, it was when we were being truthful, just when we were being ourselves. And so that comes with tremendous risk, emotional, spiritual risk, internal, relational risk. And so we don't want to take those risks again. So we wear the masks. We're not being completely truthful. It's easier to hurt a mask or to hurt a part of us that really isn't us, and at some level we know it, than it is to hurt the authentic us or the genuine us or the real us.
That's right. Yeah, it makes sense. And it also sounds like, to a degree, that when something triggers us in our environment, or a person says something that triggers us emotionally, that we're not actually responding to what's happening in the present. We're responding to something that happened before.
Correct.
So we're not living here.
Nope, we're time traveling. Exactly right. And very similar to, the way that you use timeline therapy through neurolinguistic programming is a very similar way, in the way that our brains work with respect to trauma, or the way that our bodies work. The moment that we see something in our environment, or sense something in our environment that is familiar or associated with environmentally through our senses, with one of the traumas that we experience, we become hypervigilant. So for example, this beautiful jacket that you're wearing, I like it.
Thank you.
If, let's just say, when I was a child, my father was wearing a very similar jacket to that, and he beat me, or he took that jacket from his closet and tried to choke me or something like that. I'm using an extreme example here, right? But the association that I may make is that anyone that wears that jacket, I need to be hyper vigilant. I need to be on my toes. I need to be aware. I need to keep myself safe. You haven't done anything to me, but I may now have an aversion to you because, and this could be completely implicit. Like I've got no idea this is happening. The associations that I'm making, all I know is that I get a bad feeling about you and I don't want you near me. But it's not necessarily because you've done anything or because of who you are, but it's just that reminds me of something. Now, here's where the complementary trauma plays out, which is really interesting. Let's just say that's a scenario, right? And you can apply this to any scenario. If you, let's say you're in a car, you're just before a car accident, you're eating an egg salad and you're in the passenger seat and you smell eggs and boom, car accident. You may have an aversion towards eggs and you don't even know why they're in after that point, right? I'm just giving you an example. So now I'm unconsciously sending you signals that I don't want you in my space. You, through your enteric system, through our connection here, through your nervous system being out in the world and absorbing information, is going, why is this person, what did I do? Like, why is this person being strange towards me? Why is Steph acting that way? Why is he pushing me away energetically? You may not be thinking that, but you may be feeling that. Now then you start to shut down. Is he rejecting me? Have I done something wrong? Let's just use the people pleaser example again. Pull that thread. Well, now you're going to make sure that I'm okay. Now you're going to contort yourself to behave and be in a particular way that you normally wouldn't do because you're feeling me pull away. Now all of a sudden my trauma's out, your trauma's out, and we're interacting through trauma, unresolved trauma, unconscious trauma.
Yeah.
That, I think, happens on a daily basis for most of us. And until we really we go deep within ourselves and we address our core observations of the world. That includes trauma, that includes belief systems, that includes aspirations, that includes values, that includes the way that we theme ourselves through our lives. So in other words, what we're attracted to, what we're repelled by. Until we really go deeper into our own selves, we're acting from that quote unquote unconscious place. Now, there's an argument that could say free will doesn't exist. Free will is non-existent because simply the choices that we make are a byproduct of every moment before us. And it's our body interpreting things in a certain way, interpreting life and environment in a certain way that is making decisions for us, bringing us towards something because it's safe, pulling us towards something else because it feels unsafe. But when we start addressing the core wounds that we've experienced, or the sense of I'm not safe in the world, we can maybe start to empower ourselves, or even the way that our body brain functions is less vigilant. That opens us up to being more truthful, to feeling safer in the world, to being more confident to say, you would say to me, hey man, I'm sensing that you're pulling away from me. Have I done something? Because you're less concerned about offending me and more concerned about a repair in the relationship, or just getting to the quote unquote truth.
Yes.
Which we struggle with.
Yeah. That's a really interesting approach, because what I was going to ask you is that if somebody is listening to this and they're kind of becoming aware of their own traumas or the way that they might be interacting with people in their lives, people that they like, and they're thinking to themselves, going into these old patterns like, oh, why are they being like this? What could they do instead of responding in that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would actually start with before you even get to that point, what work are you doing on yourself before that? So for example, right, healing is a journey of solitude, but it's also a collective healing. So I'm reading a book at the moment. I've got a few audiobooks and books that I sort of read at the same time. One of them is Great Mythologies of the World. And it was very interesting. I'm up to a point where the gentleman is speaking to some Native American cultures, very specifically to grief. And so grief at some level is usually, not always, but usually instigated by a trauma of some sort. So if a loved one passes, we use death as an example. So a loved one dies, physically dies, and there's a sadness with that. And that can be considered a traumatic event. Yes, it's a natural part of life, but it's also a traumatic event, right? The way that nervous system interprets that can be very heavy and intense. And so what this gentleman was saying was that many cultures from this region, what is currently known as the United States of America now, and Canada and so forth, they would go through grieving processes where you had to grieve as a collective. You had to grieve in the presence of others. I'm going somewhere with this as well. And generally in a very short period of time, like 9 hours, you grieve and you grieve well, because otherwise if you grieve extensively, which it's interestingly enough, it goes against Western conception of grief to some extent, which is grieve for as long as you need to. And I believe that there's an element of that, but grieving in groups, grieving in trusted, respected, safe groups of people accelerates our grief or accelerates our healing, so to speak, right? So when you ask that question, what came to me was, can you begin to heal? Can an individual begin to heal and allow themselves to be witnessed and seen in safe spaces? So when they get to an uncomfortable situation, they've created so much safety in their own bodies because they've been a witness to that. It's been reflected back to them. They've been seen with non-judgment and compassion over periods of time. And so your nervous system has been exposed to that. When you are exposed to an intimate environment, maybe just a one-on-one situation where that person is behaving in a way that is uncomfortable to you, instead of retracting or going back into your old patterns of survival, you will lean in and get curious. And curiosity can only exist when there is safety. So it's all about, you hear this, 80% prep, 20% execution. Sporting teams play once a week for a few months a year, right? But how much training they do? Twice a day, 3 times a day? In season, off season? Consistently. So the preparation for that, for the uncomfortable situation, really matters. And what I'm saying is what's very useful is healing in the presence of the safety of others, and safety becomes the healing.
Yes.
It's a long-winded way of answering your question.
Yeah, it's a perfect answer, because now actually a lot of what I experienced with you at the retreat makes a lot of sense, right? I got to have this experience of this somatic release where I went into, for lack of a better term, a rage in front of a group of other men, and had never done that in my life before. Maybe when I was a child, not remembering, maybe from a tantrum, but doing it as an adult in front of other men who were seeing me and holding a safe environment, allowing me to experience those
and not judging you.
And not judging me, right? Totally embracing what I was experiencing. What's fascinating about that is that it became very easy to draw boundaries following that experience. Like incredibly easy.
That's awesome, man. And I would say everything you've done up to that point allowed you to then draw boundaries very easily after that. Because let's just assume that was your first experience of going deep within yourself. It probably would have taken more experiences, different experiences for you to then, draw those boundaries. I think that was a catalyst for you, or, sort of the icing on the cake or the cherry on the pie, or whatever it is, right? Because you've done so much deeper work on yourself. Am I correct in saying that?
Correct.
Yeah, you've been on this path for years, right? So all of that counts and all of that matters. All of that compound. That's you putting money in the bank. That's you saving, right? And then, years later, it's like, oh, I've got a few $1 million here. I didn't even realize. Wow. Yeah, that's what it is. It's your emotional bank, that your the healing that you're doing along the way that allowed that experience to come to fruition for you to so easily say, yes, let's do this. And then for you to go, wow, and allow your body to evolve, essentially, allow your whole being to evolve, and then say, I'm making changes in my life now. To a testament to you is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a beautiful experience, and definitely one that I'll always remember because of what it did for me and how it reframed the way that I even see being emotional around other men. I didn't have going into that, I didn't necessarily have a belief that I shouldn't be emotional around other men, but it wasn't exactly an easy go-to, right? Especially a lot of my background is in Stoicism, right? I've studied Stoicism for a long time. This podcast is the Zen Stoic path. There's a reason why I added Zen to the mix. And it's to bring the humanity into the philosophical idealism that Stoicism can sometimes trail off into. And so what do you feel like prevents people from essentially normalizing doing these processes like grief in a collective? What do you think gets in the way, and what could people maybe do instead?
I think shame gets in the way that our culture deals with sex, sexuality, grief, pain, big emotions, sadness, mental disequilibration. Did I say that right? Like or mental disharmony. In other words, if someone is appearing to be out of their mind, or let's put them in a mental asylum, or let's put them in jail, or let's isolate them. There's not an embrace for difference at a level, right? We see that in all the isms that we experience in our world, right? And the division that we experience in our world as well. And so, I think it's important that we're able to see beyond that. Yeah, seeing beyond that is difficult because we struggle to see ourselves. Because of that shame. Yeah. Because, we were told, oh, you're not enough, or you're too much, or you're not good enough, or you're doing it wrong. And when we're told that enough times, that and everything else, or we're abused. And so we interpret that as, well, I'm not worthy. If I'm being abused, I'm not enough, right? So when we experience events like that and experiences like that enough, we formulate these ideals and beliefs of who we are, which really stops us from expressing ourselves fully because we're so scared to be seen.
That's right.
And we don't create environments for ourselves, and we're not welcomed, generally speaking, into environments where someone genuinely says all of you is welcome. So if you're angry, bring your anger. Now, of course, if you're physically attacking someone, that you've got to set healthy boundaries around that. But we're talking about expression of that individual that's been pent up and is just being expressed in the world, and you as an individual or a group of people are holding space for that, meaning you're not bringing your own triggers and your own pain into that. You're not taking offense to that person being sad or angry or whatever expression they're going through, and you're not shaming that person. You're not judging them for that. You're understanding that there's some stuff that has been locked up in the closet or in the basement for a very long time, and it needs to come out and air out, and you can see beyond the intensity of that emotional expression. But the only way to be able to do that is for us ourselves to be able to go through that. Yeah. Us ourselves to be able to experience a new way of being in the world that is non-judgmental and is extreme and intense, and there's no repercussions for that. Again, I'm not saying you harm other people. I'm not saying you project your anger and your violence onto someone else. That's why rage rooms are a great tool for releasing big emotion, right? Absolutely. Intense emotion. So I think that answers your question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It definitely does. And it reminds me, one of the books that I've been reading lately, I just finished it, is Nonviolent Communication. And that one I thought was really fascinating because what it showed me is that most of the time when people are communicating and they're using value judgments or they're using criticisms, what they're actually communicating are unexpressed needs. And they might think to themselves that they're expressing their emotions, but they're not actually feeling anything. They're just saying their value judgment. They might be saying something like, you never listen to me, or I feel like you don't understand me. It's not a feeling necessarily, and there's an emotion behind that. And being that we won't even go there because we'll use value judgments or criticisms to protect ourselves, I find that has been difficult for me in the past. And once I started saying, I feel this emotion, or like maybe I feel confusion, or maybe I feel stressed, or maybe I feel scared, and this is what I need. That has transformed communication, not just for myself, but for the people that I get to coach. Having that ability to express emotion and needs to somebody as vulnerability has allowed a lot of my clients to be able to have much more fruitful conversations with those that they've had difficulty with in the past. So I find that to be extremely useful to be able to say that. And the other thing that this also reminded me of is I'm a big fan of Alan Watts, and he had when he was talking about Carl Jung one time, this was after Carl Jung had died, and he was talking about a conversation that he had. And he was saying that one of the reasons why Carl Jung was so good at what he did is not because of how wise and creative he was, but it was because that when he was sitting across from one of his patients, there was this twinkle in his eye that reminded you that he knew that no matter how much he achieved in his life, that he was somewhat of a rascal no matter what. And he accepted that within himself so he could accept it within others. And Alan Watts called that the trait of irreducible rascality. And that if we can accept that, if we can accept that in ourselves, we can accept it more easily in others. Typically when other people trigger us, it's something we haven't dealt with ourselves.
Yeah, and that's the thing, man. It's over, and I'm quote unquote guilty of this. If someone behaves in a way that upsets me or reminds me consciously or unconsciously of hardship or heartache or difficulty that I've experienced, I'll often, still to this day, it's definitely minimized and it's definitely tempered. But still to this day, I will go to being very defensive and very aggressive and very abrasive and using my intellect to talk down to them, or my physical strength, or whatever it may be, right? Like there's the energy of that, at least. There's the energy of that circulating through me because I feel so threatened. And so what it reveals to me is that whilst I've come a very long way in dealing with so much of my trauma, there's just happens to still be more there. And accepting that for me has actually been one of the biggest breakthroughs of my life. And it's not just, I accept it and then, set and forget. Unfortunately for me, at least, it's not exactly that. It needs to be a constant reminder in the moment, the moment of feeling my adrenaline spike or feeling myself be agitated or hyper defensive. It's slowing down and regulating in those moments and reminding myself of how far I've come, reminding myself this is a beautiful protective part of me. I'm adept in parts work and parts therapy, internal family systems and so forth. So I lean into those tools as an example to work with that part of me that is really feeling threatened right now. And I do my best. I don't always get it right. And sometimes I can hear it in my tone. I sense it in my body that I've gone over the line, my own line, and maybe even over that person's line. I don't know, but my line, I've crossed over where I haven't been regulated. And so can I meet myself with compassion, acceptance, and non-judgment? Honestly, man, people often ask me, what is some of the greatest gifts that you've received? And it's compassion, non-judgment from other human beings, which has helped me be that for myself.
Yeah.
It's honestly one of the biggest gifts that I've ever received. And it's a work in progress for me, at least. It's still a work in progress.
Yeah. And the fact that someone like yourself who works with the people that you do, you have the content that you put out there regarding relationships and trauma, for you to be able to say, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, for you to be able to say, I still deal with my traumas and that's okay. That's huge for anybody listening, because I feel like sometimes we can be looking at people that we look up to, teachers, coaches, mentors, and thinking to ourselves that they got it all together. And that in my past, at least, has been one of the most disempowering patterns that I've had, is looking up to my mentors and thinking that they were perfect, that they had dealt with everything, and then looking at myself and going, what's wrong with me? And so I think it's huge. And I honor you for saying that here, because it helps me. It helps anybody listening, especially for whoever's on the path of their own healing. And so I'm curious, all this work, how did this lead towards the context of life of relationships? Because I noticed that that's where a lot of your work is done, and that seems to be an area of passion for you. What brought you there?
Yeah, I think I remember Dr. John DeMartini, and I say this often. I heard him say, I was in one of his seminars once, and I heard him say, our voids become our values. And relationships were very unsafe for me growing up and very difficult. With my parents, with my grandparents, difficult in the sense with my grandparents and my extended family, my uncles, my aunties, my cousins, was that I missed them so much, and I was pulled from, my parents made decisions to be in one country, then another country, and so it was challenging, and I felt pulled, and then the volatility growing up in my immediate family dynamic. So relationships were just very hard, and so naturally I gravitated towards, how do I refine intimacy? How do I, make intimacy great again? I was thinking Donald Trump, make intimacy great again.
I'm getting the hat.
I think I'm going to get that. That's pretty good. I like that. We'll make it
Let me know when the merch is out.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. Making intimacy. I had a chuckle to myself before I said it because I thought of it. Making intimacy great again, which is what I wanted to do. Yeah. And then I realized that how important our relationships are, quality relationships or any relationships, and what we can learn and grow from them, and how much of a teacher they are.
Yes.
And how much they show us about ourselves, the mirrors and the reflections that they are for us, especially being in an intimate, sacred union or an intimate relationship, a romantic, a sexual relationship with someone, and then even having a child, which I'm a very new father, which is just, it's blowing me away in all the ways across the spectrum, in really difficult ways and really profound, enlightening ways that are just opening my heart in ways it's never been opened before. And so that's me in relationship to my daughter. That's me in relationship to my wife. That's me in relationship to myself. And so I figured along the way with, yes, all my study, all my research, and all my direct experience and my reflection, my deliberate reflection upon my direct experience, that relationships are really fucking important.
Yeah.
And we can either be purposeful and proactive and deliberate with our relationships, or we can be reactive and be a victim to our relationships and be someone that just is a passerby. And I didn't want to be that because I was so disempowered as a kid. So I wanted to be empowered. And so I wanted to prioritize relationships in my life. And so much of the content I create, or the things that I speak to, are me still working through stuff. And I've also been studying this for 22 years.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about timeline therapy and NLP. I did NLP about 18 years ago.
Wow.
When it wasn't very popular.
Yeah.
You know, so like I studied it. Yeah, before it was cool, right? So I literally, when I was 22. So I'm 40 now. So it's I've been in this space for a really long time, and Victor, it feels like I've hardly touched the surface. You know, like I could say, yeah, I've been in this space for 2 decades, deliberately. And it feels like I've been in here for a few months.
Yeah.
There's so much to learn. And I can't remember who said this. I think it was Socrates or Plato, like the moment that and I'm bastardizing the phrase, but the moment we think we know everything is the moment we know nothing.
That's right.
Maybe it's exactly like that. I don't know. But you get the gist though, right? And so I don't claim to know everything about relationships. I am still, you know, to be completely transparent, having a child, again, it's a paradox, man. Life is a paradox. It's one of the most beautiful, profound experiences that I've ever witnessed and been a part of. And it is one of the most challenging. Not because she's a problem child. She's actually, generally speaking, a really easy baby, super happy baby. But the sleep deprivation adds up, which is, you know, she's going through her cycle. She's adapting to this new world. The stress that's placed on mum and me and our relationship and navigating that, we're both not necessarily navigating that in the best ways, but we do our best to come back to repair. We do our best to come back to have honest conversations. We do our best to nurture each other and love each other and see beyond the intensity of the moment. It's no joke that, I don't know what the exact statistic is, but 70+% of couples break up in the first year of having a child.
Wow.
That's a very high statistic, man. We've moved away, slightly tangential here, but we've moved away from taking a village to raise a child. And I think that's part of the issue, is that we don't have enough support. And hiring support is one thing, and it's very helpful, but being actually in a village where you're in a community of people that have your best interests at heart and vice versa, we're somewhat missing that, even though one of the biggest reason we're in Austin is because of community, and we have amazing community here. We're still all scattered in different places, in different suburbs, 30 minutes away, 20 minutes away, 10 minutes away. We're not living in compounds, for lack of a better term, anymore. So that adds a lot of pressure and stress, and relationships become strained that way as well. You know, we're missing human contact in real meaningful ways. We're so busy in this world, so busy doing and creating. And I love doing and creating. I love creating content, for lack of a better term, but expression and so forth. And all of that is derived from my direct experience with people.
Yes.
With being in love with people and being in difficulty with people. All of it. Not just accepting the convenient, which is, you know, the pleasant, when my baby's sleeping, or when my wife is kind to me, or when she's done something nice for me, but also when she's sleep deprived and snappy, or when I haven't done something that she needed me to do and she's upset at me. Like, can I still love her through that? Can I still be in right relationship with that as well? This is the challenge, man. Like, this is the work.
Yeah. And it's living in the paradox and being able to flow through that, I feel, is what allows us to be fulfilled in life. It makes me think of the backwards law, that you cannot have light without dark, up without down. The more you want to be loved, the more you feel unlovable. And so if we allow ourselves not to just take in the subject of the portrait, but the entire background and everything that goes with that, then we're able to better navigate the uncertainties and the difficulties of life and enjoy the pleasant moments, enjoy the pleasurable moments. I think there was a reel that I saw from you the other day that was talking about how people, they just want the pleasant thing and they don't want to deal with any of this stuff. And frankly, it's not how that works.
Not in the world of duality. No, it's
No.
not.
As long as you're asking for something, you're going to experience its opposite. And how you navigate that is the art in which you bring to the conversation.
And also how you navigate that determines the quality of what you receive and how you receive it as well. So I think it's very important to understand that what helps us recognize that which we desire is at some level apophatically realizing what we don't want and what we don't desire unconsciously and or consciously, and creating distinction, non-judgmental distinction or non-biased distinction between those two helps us gravitate towards that thing that we desire. And I don't think there's anything wrong with desire. I think when we compound desires, plural, and there's too many of them, I think it distracts us and hurts us. But I think there's desire actually propels us into new states of being as well.
That's right. I've looked at it. I have a framework with Zen Stoic that makes it its own philosophy, and it's a framework of intentions and delusions. Whereas intentions will point you back to the human experience and of your direct individual experience. And delusions point you into abstraction or conceptualization of the direct experience. And so one of them is discipline versus expediency. And expediency is the prioritization of gratification over meaning, whereas discipline is to be a student of something bigger than yourself and to prioritize meaning over gratification. One of the things that I see that is the way that we act out expediency is we use our desires to bypass unpleasant experience. We exploit the passions of life. We will go and drink or eat or watch TV to not feel the thing that we are facing in that moment. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things in isolation, but if we use them to exploit our emotions, that is when I find that buildup of emotional debt comes in. Whereas if we take the time to understand it and we have the discipline to say, okay, there's something here for me because it keeps coming up. Let me learn what's going on and let me express it and actualize this into something meaningful for myself now and in the future. And that's where I find that I've been able to have a lot of breakthroughs in that. One of those actually came before the current relationship that I'm in. And I remember I had gotten divorced in 2020 and I was single for a while. And the biggest emotion that I would feel on a regular basis was loneliness. And I got to this point where I'd done a lot of work on myself. And I got to this point where I became able to be alone without being lonely. And 2 weeks later, I met my life partner. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, of that little breakthrough that happened there. Being alone without feeling lonely.
Yeah, it's the art of non-attachment, right? The moment we don't need the thing presents itself to us.
That's right.
So my thoughts are just very beautifully what you shared then. I'm in just deep resonance with. How long were you married for?
I was married for only a year.
Okay.
Yeah, COVID expedited the process of
interesting
of that, being in close quarters constantly.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I find that fascinating. It's it almost reveals so much about, well, so many layers to that, isn't there? You know, when I met my wife, we first met, we moved in together the first day. So we figured out very quickly. Moved in together meaning that we shared a hotel room and then hotel rooms as we were traveling, and then we lived together. So
just right into
day
it.
one, yeah. And so you sort of figured out very quickly, being in close proximity to each other, what that was like. And I'm not saying that's the path or the way to go. I find human dynamics and relationships fascinating.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, I think it's really beautiful, man. I think you got yourself to a place where you're very deliberate with your awareness around who you were and who you were being, and you were very honest with yourself around loneliness isn't serving you in this capacity. Like it's a crux, it's a wound. Like, what would happen if I healed that wound? At some level, you ask yourself that question.
Yeah.
What would happen if I healed that wound? And you got your answer.
That's right.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
And because it is. And our fear is, oh, if I heal the wound, then I'll never be with anyone, or no one will ever want me, or because I don't need anyone. And so we hang on to the neediness, or we hang on to the wound. But the truth of it is, that's not how it works.
That's right. Yeah. I have 2 more questions for you before we wrap up.
Yeah.
The first one is, what are you most excited about right now that you're doing or experiencing in life?
Yeah, so from a personal perspective, it's really, leaning deeper into my family because, I have a propensity to escape, to want to escape. And this is a very difficult thing for me to say out loud as well, let alone, in a public forum. But if I'm not honest with it, and, I've done enough work around it to be stable with it. So that's why I can share it. But if I'm not honest with it, then, we go back to what you said earlier around these false ideals that we create for ourselves and for others, And so I just want to be really honest with, when things get difficult, I have a propensity to escape. I did it as a kid. I used TV, I used food. I would physically hide, it's in my nervous system to hide and to move away from, As an adult, it was sex and orgasm and validation through women and adrenaline and travel, lots of travel. Not that I don't travel now, I do very much. It's a big value of mine, but it also was a way to escape, right? And so now as things are difficult, I find myself, maybe, why should I be married? And should I have had a child? And, you go through, sometimes we will go through, and I will go through these questions, these internal questions. And when I really sit with them, I'm not asking the right question. I'm asking the question out of fear. I'm asking the question from an old version of myself. Because the reality is, when I look at my wife and I look at my family, and I look at what I have and what I'm deeply grateful for, when I look at my child, man, there's nothing that I'm so full and I'm so grateful, even if it's difficult. And that's the truth.
Yeah.
And there are layers of me that are being shed that will ask those questions and say, maybe, I could be climbing mountains right now, or I could be doing this, or I could be doing that. Like the grass is green, or whatever the fuck it is. And so keeping those in check is really, really important. So I mentioned that because you asked me, what am I excited about? And so I want to be very truthful around being very excited about, watching my girl grow up, and actually excited about coming into deeper connection with my wife. Not because we've been disconnected, but because connection has just been strained and difficult, right? At some level, not completely, not 100% of the time, but more difficult than it has been ever in our relationship. And so I'm excited about that and learning and growing through that as well. And so that the other part to that is that there is a shadow side of me that still comes out. And as a man and as men, it's important that we acknowledge these as a human being really, but we acknowledge that these shadow parts are there and we don't shame them. So hence why, one of the ways that we deal with shame and we heal shame is by bringing it to the light. So that's what I'm doing here now. So with respect to my creative expression and business in the world and business endeavors in the world, there's a number of things that I'm very excited about. And I'm very grateful to be able to create in the way that I do. And so one of them is an ecosystem and platform that I've co-founded called Asaraya. And we're a number of things, but we're a community and a hub for leaders, for exceptional leaders in the world. And we are the world's first platform to unify ancient intelligence and wisdom with emerging technology essentially for the purposes of regenerating our planet and to create a better world. And we use Web3 applications and Web3 technologies to do so. And a number of, this is what I wanted to invite you to actually.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. I was like, I hope this is the thing he's invited me to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're private round invitations now. And it's really, really powerful and really exciting on many fronts and many levels. And the people that we have involved are just fucking epic.
Amazing.
That, and then, the work that I do in the world, my coaching, the transformative work that I do in the world with my wife as well, my coaching institute, breath work for the feminine, which is a monthly event that is live here in Austin and then live streamed and recorded. It's a women's only event, but that's a 3-hour somatic immersive. Beautiful. As well. So that's, I'm really excited about the things that I'm creating in the world from that perspective too.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to and very grateful for that invite and really excited about what you're doing in the world as well. It sounds amazing. And not only what you're doing and focusing on, but also the way that you're navigating through the difficult parts and doing them sometimes with grace, sometimes with a little bit more, frustration that might come up, but you're doing it. And I feel like that is the way that we navigate these uncertainties and these difficulties in life, which leads me to my next question, which I like to ask all my guests on this particular segment of the podcast. Zen Stoic is a philosophy that aims to bring somebody towards their own personal liberation, whatever that might mean for them. but the philosophy itself is not liberation, just like the finger is pointing at the moon is not the moon. And so I always like to ask my guests when they come on here, what does it mean to you to live a liberated life?
So many responses just surging through me. It's almost like you ever seen Bloodsport?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you remember when Van Damme is blindfolded and he's getting the koi out of the... Yeah, I feel like Van Damme right now. Which koi do I choose? Which koi do I choose? Be a reference for you older folk. How old are you?
I'm
Do you remember me asking?
31.
31. You're young and you still love Bloodsport. That's awesome. That warms my heart, brother. That warms
I
my
saw
heart.
it very young, but I still loved it.
Yeah, it warms my heart. So for those of you that don't know, you should watch it. The thing that keeps coming back to me, that keeps circulating in my mind, is this not being dictated by our pain, right? In other words, our hypervigilance, the protective strategies, the defensive strategies that we create in the presence of conflict or trauma or difficulty, that then orientate us towards being extra safe, aka hypervigilant. And when we can liberate ourselves from that, when we can heal that and expand through that and close the trauma loop physiologically and learn to regulate our nervous systems and be more adaptive and resilient in the world, I believe that is a strong precursor to lending itself towards liberation, whatever that may be for an individual. At least psycho-emotional, relational liberation.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Steph, thank you so much for being on the show. Where can people find you? And
yeah. Thanks, man. On social media, at Stefanos Safandos, and my website, stefanosafandos.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being on the Zen Stoic Path.
Thanks, brother.